Tall Tales. The Nymph Symphony.
Chapters.
Chapter 23. Southshore. Given a little time for the majority to arrive, the air had felt much more tense than how it looked, considering the whole beautiful mid-afternoon beach setting we sat amidst. Akoni and I were seated together down by the fence posts of the track between the field and sands, while our bubbly princess played with her new metal pet, throwing a tiny bronze wheel for it between the beach and coast. 30 or so grizzly frontline soldiers joined us, sitting or standing nearby, peering anxiously towards their queen as she made her way towards the stone, the lot of them nervously awaiting confirmation that they could take the quick way back home. Milena talked quietly with Dr. Maxwell beside the large and narrow marble gateway stone, clearly deliberating whether or not Camilla would be able enough to operate and sustain the portal to deliver us all instantaneously back to the capital's training pits, where another adjacent gateway stone resides. It had been more than a painstaking endeavor for those everyday foot soldiers around us, as it was more than just an ordinary march this time. They were all exhausted and dehydrated, and simply wanted to leave as soon as possible. But given the looks and frowns of concern radiating from the Queen and Doctor, I think they were all starting to realize the inevitability of what was to come. Another solid day of marching to reach the capital by foot. I watched my queen while she waved and fluttered her hands across the dark marble stone and its smooth grooved incantations, and then gestured some form of reference to Camilla's gold ankle restraint that was bound across her leg like some form of binding weighted shackle. Camilla was still locked away in the medical carriage, which was stationed at the forefront of the other wagons, by the ravine and short initial grass-clearing entrance that we had all come in from before our arrival upon this flat, secluded shoreline. It was too disheartening for anyone else but myself to continue watching them talk, for I think in all the soldiers' hearts they already knew the answer, but wanted to believe that perhaps something might miraculously change if they turned a blind eye to the conversation happening between the Queen and the Doctor. Clearly the Legion commander had not improved very much since her stay in the medical carriage. The melted handprint grip imprinted across the width of her skin were not going to simply fall off when the old surrounding surface skin was to shed. They were indeed locked upon her as constricting as a steel vice. A prolonged consequence of such swelling and agony made her too much of a liability to power up a device that could potentially portal us into the bottom of the ocean or the empty oblivion of space, should she lack the mental aptitude to use it appropriately. "Hey, Akoni," I said to my quiet friend as he sat in the sand just to the right of me. "Yeah," he responded absent-mindedly, fiddling with his own removable electric metal wrist bracer and its inner web-like circuitry. "What are you working on?" I asked, intrigued, watching him make what looked like some fairly major upgrades to his wrist bracer. He was ripping out its raw components and essential silver wiring, removing things in aggressive and careless segments, only to then add tiny little droplets of seawater from a tiny pipette straw-like instrument he had in his backpack. A long delay pursuing from whence I asked, as he remained in great concentration while renovating his old technology with some newer, more exotic type of wireless technology, it would seem to appear. "Huh, I'm sorry, what did you say?" Akoni eventually replied back, half a minute later, once I had already trailed off and started watching his new pet puppy roll on its back and then shake away the sand in a tail-wagging playtime. "Never mind," I said, thinking it would be potentially disastrous to distract him with conversation, instead choosing to silently watch him while he replaced metal brackets and wires with clay fixings, obviously working to invent some new form of electro-aquatic system that was free of quartz. Some three-dimensional circuitry upgrade he had been inspired to attempt upon the success of his recent toy pet protector project, Puppy, the resurrection of a hellhoundish beast that was currently frolicking around his young hometown sweetheart. Once given the freedom of choice and consequence, Puppy was an overly affectionate, four-legged predator, a raptor that could find joy in anything as it searched and sniffed the sands in search for precious gold to consume, much like how it was originally developed to do. However, this time, any treasure it found it was going to eat in order to fuel and power its new self-sustaining flaming purple robotic heart. Puppy was harmlessly sniffing and digging in the sand, excited by its first time being at the beach, and Era called to it over and over, trying to commandeer its attention towards herself, seeing as it had free will and did not strictly have to follow commands anymore. I had to admit that made me pretty nervous at times, with my panic having to be kept low-key each time it ran up beside me to munch on the silver wiring a coney fed it. My greatest concern being what new mad science experiment was going to surpass this converted predator while he continued to tinker with his wrist device and draw and calculate his maths with a stick in the sand, working off some revolutionary paper schematics he must have simply dreamed about overnight and written down on the march. "Akoni, say it's all over," I said to him as I sorely readjusted my back against the hard wooden post we shared back support against. "And say there's no more civil terror. Why is it still so important for us to fix the sun spire?" I rather boldly stated, shocking him enough that he looked up from his work to stare at me. "You really want to be asking that kind of question so close to the queen?" he responded, gazing towards Milena, who was currently discussing with her son and the other high-ranking soldiers what the best route back home would be. "No, I'm serious. The gnolls were by far the worst predators in the night," I responded, determined that at least one person should dare question the decision to repair the sunspire, although also knowing that Milena was far enough away not to hear. "Well, I guess it's more for prosperity than anything else," he mused. "You know, in case a famine ever comes back," he elaborated. "Why? What are you wondering about?" he then asked, intrigued, no doubt trying to figure out if my motives were self-righteous or self-indulgent, and whether I was going to preach something about his father that others wouldn't dare say out loud. "I was just wondering, it's necessity is all. I know the nocturnal predators are terrifying and dangerous, but our roads are very well protected now. Why are we in such a rush to deactivate the old crystal and reinstall the new one when we could just wait to see if the herbivore to carnivore ratio declines before jumping to the conclusion that the famine will return?" I ranted, hoping I wasn't offending him too much, considering he had spent much of his life trying to fix the faltering spire. "Well, yeah, perhaps we could go without it temporarily. Go back to seeing the moon and stars again. But we have the crystal now. Why not just use it to improve our livelihoods?" he replied, somewhat defensively. "But what if it came at a cost?" I bantered. What? What cost?" he immediately bantered back. "I don't know. A cost. Some unknown cost." I spieled out, finally getting to the point of my argument, the words of his delusional father stuck echoing in my head. I began to feel a small discord growing between us, based primarily upon Akoni's silent stare towards me, realizing I definitely had hit a sore spot this time, considering I was belittling his life's work while also speculating about the chance that he and his mother had abandoned his father on a false assumption that he was crazy. "Light feeds everything. You know that, right?" he added in lecture. "Even you, my friend." He then teased, bumping me sideways and off the post playfully, thinking I'd only asked because I wanted more darkness to enhance my own skills, that I was merely afraid I was about to be back in a place that made me the most weak and feeble individual all over again. "So what are you doing with that thing anyway?" I asked, changing the subject away from me and pointing to his wrist bracer, watching him again reopen its ceramic casing so he could force a fingertip of crackly electrical current into a small pocket of submerged tiny crystals deep inside the armband circuit matrix. "Hard to say. I'm not really sure, to be honest," he confessed. "It was based on very old designs," he explained, pointing to the solvent liquids in the bracelet as it began to glow from its crystal core. "Some say water and electricity don't mix, but that's a huge misconception," he stated. "See, the problem is they work together too well. My father wrote about this radical idea in his journal once, that using salt water instead of wires to transmit current would allow for a radial circuitry instead of conventional series and parallel, and that having a shell-layered orbital system would therefore yield a much higher compression rate for useful reactants, so long as the solvents don't merge with those of the different level densities." "And why is there suddenly a need for the risky upgrade?" I pondered back to him. "Well, because I think it's the same quick but sophisticated method my father used to create the locking imprints he put around my mother," he answered, taking off his glasses and rubbing his forehead as he did so, no doubt trying to politely work out how exactly he could simplify things for me to understand. "So the imprints are corroded and molded onto my mother's skin, with engravings that could act as circuit pathways. So maybe he knows exactly how to unlock those bindings, given the right voltage in its altering sequence. But this kind of technology is far too advanced for me. Akoni, I stated, grabbing his shoulder as a comfort before I wished to proceed with my question. I don't want to be negative, but not everything your father does is elaborate and well thought through. What makes you so sure those bindings he put on your mother came with some form of failsafe? He was weak and desperate in the final moments before his defeat. Mistakes can happen, even to clever men like him. It is reversible, he immediately refuted. How can you be so sure? Because it is, he stubbornly responded, realizing by his own immediate response that he was without evidence and sounding irrational. That he had taken it on faith that his mother's restraints could be removed by simply deciphering some hidden chemical code. Okay, then I do too, I said sympathetically. You're right. Anything is possible. There's a lot of things still left unanswered. And I'm sure if we're patient enough, we'll get to the bottom of all of them. I then tried to reassure him, lowering my hand off his shoulder and rubbing his back with comforting resolve. For the two of us, that was new territory crossed, as we never really addressed issues of vulnerability or awkwardness. Our friendship was mostly platonic and formal, with stubborn pride usually keeping either of us from confiding in one another over anything at all. You know what is funny about all of this? He asked me. I think I was better off never knowing. The times were actually easier when soldiers used to tease me about my dad going crazy, rather than having them now avoid eye contact with me each time they passed me by. Well then, I guess there really is just no pleasing you, I joked, trying to lighten the mood, and because I couldn't think of any more comforting words to say. For the first time in a long time, I was genuinely lost for word. I used to be able to relate with him back when I believed we were both fatherless. But so much about that current situation felt so wrong and unexplained. Like they were trying to piece together a story made up of two completely separate jigsaw puzzles, with all the pieces jumbled together in a confusing mess. And although I knew that, much like a coney, I had an obsessive habit for over-evaluating the world around me. Regardless, I just couldn't accept how things seemed to tie together. I was adamant something was being covered up. As at the very center of everything, there was our current queen who was clearly refusing to take the easy option back home. Was Carolee getting ready to leave the scene so that her officers could deliver the news to their soldiers and have to deal with the aftermath of forcing them to take the long way home? I watched the queen leave the group of soldiers and head in a separate direction to the doctor. Within that same small circle of smoothed buried pebble stones that ringed around the gateway stone, I could tell that Arlo and his vanguard unit were all conjugating in a heated and bitter discussion of how to relay Melina's commands with this unhappy combatants they were responsible for. I watched Arlo interact with them from that small distance, standing there by the pillar and its sandy shoreline, wondering how he could give his orders without being hated by all of his old friends. Devilishly, though, I was secretly hoping for one more night before my world would return back to normal. One more day of travel to ask all the things that I wanted to ask, and yet say all the things I wanted to say, knowing that it would be the only time I could ever do so. "Akoni," Melina shouted out, walking towards him and me with a limp, in a slow but determined march. "I'm going to need your aid with something," she stated to him, standing over us both. "We're going to make a camp here through the twilight, but we need fresh water, and all we've got to work with is the ocean and its saltwater ravines. Is there anything you can think of that might help us make fresh water?" she asked. Yeah, if we can make clay, I believe I can think of something, Your Majesty," he answered back after a quick look around the area. "Actually, never mind. We could also just melt the sand into glass," he then said, thinking out loud while Melina tapped her fingers against her sore leg impatiently. "So, you have an idea?" the queen pressed. Yes, I do. We could, remove the salt from the seawater if we can make a few clay jugs and bonfires," he proceeded to explain. "Okay, well, you just go up to Southshore and tell him exactly what you need, and he'll order the men to get started," Melina said to him, offering her hand to help pull him up, politely insisting he get started straight away, although patiently waiting while he bent back down to collect all the little tools and parts he left scattered over the sands around both of us. "Well, for starters, we're going to need a lot of wood tonight," he mentioned to Melina while she ushered him towards Southshore. "Okay, fine. Be sure to tell him that," she stated. All right, come here, puppy. I need you now, he called out towards his and Anera's special companion, which left Anera to chase after him happily through the sand. Untie that thing up when you're done with it, Milena then ordered upon his drifting departure. It's scaring the soldiers. At that point, I realized I was alone beside my queen, with no one there to defend me. Milena continued to stand quietly over me, her gleaming blue eyes locked on mine. I gulped rather noticeably. Kaya, can I please have a few words with you? She then said with a strange and formal politeness to her tone, something I found even more disconcerting than the usual snarky voice she used with me, considering no one else was there for her to need to hide her typical aggression towards me. Yes, of course, Your Majesty, I responded in kind, getting up quickly while she turned away, heading towards a field of piling up caravans, which were left loaded up yet unguarded. She didn't look back to see if I was coming, but indicated for me to follow her all the way towards the end of the caravan line. We passed the regiments, all arriving as other thankful soldiers dived into the ocean, just to cool down from the heat. We continued to walk down the beach pathway, silently and slowly, as I swallowed my own dread, wondering just how much trouble I was in. I was foolish to think I might have avoided the consequences of my actions. I hoped Nera was lurking nearby, invisible, ready to come to my aid, should I need it. On the left of me, we had the coast and the option of taking the solitary but scenic march home, whereas to the right was the option of going inland and passing through Treadfall, a place where we would be offered a royal welcome, with food and refreshments, and could travel along the paved and protected gravel roads all the way back home. As I walked along the beach with Arlo's mother, I looked for him in some hope he might see me, but I could see he had his own problems, with him looking as if he was trying to explain to angry soldiers why we were taking the long scenic route back home, the option that would increase our travel time by at least half a day, and meant staying on the sands through the twilight rather than receiving both shelter and food from a neighboring village of the crown. Arlo was leaning against the marble gateway stone, acting as if it were nothing more than a colorful rock, rather than a magical transportation device. He appeared to be blocking it from the soldiers while he convinced this man about the Queen's decision to undertake the less conventional path back home. I was surprised that Zephyr wasn't among the soldiers arguing against the choice of path, but was rather in agreement with the plan to stay along the beaches, a plan that meant he wouldn't see his village. So it would seem Midas's capture was a big deal to all parties involved, a terrifying individual to be left in joint custody overnight. It was as if his words were more infectious than his touch, making our queen very cautious and paranoid about where he was to stay and who he was to talk to. I guess more worried about his slick silver tongue than his two gold corrosive hands. Until this point, I hadn't wished to even think about the implications of Midas's return. But as it was so close to being near, I had no choice but to start wondering what would happen to him upon his arrival back into the capital. He was too dangerous to be banished, and yet too resourceful to be imprisoned once again. He would most likely be executed, an absolute travesty that a man of a clear mental sickness, whose former deeds once saved our entire society, was going to be killed, simply because he was too dangerous to be allowed any measure of mercy or leniency. With a shiver running endlessly down my spine, Milena and I wandered past each regiment in their individual caravans, those arriving soldiers timidly bowing before their queen as they snickered and smiled at me, acting as if I were a child about to be disciplined by a parent, and they were my fellow siblings who had been just as naughty, yet managed to escape getting into trouble. I wished it were the case of a simple parental scolding, but I knew it was going to be a lot worse than that. And so, fearing the worst, I headed up side hills and along dunes with my queen, the path taking us through the small beech shrubs as we took a shortcut towards the back of the line, entering the flat grassy stretch of land that led up from the mountains, all while I feigned a confident bravado, despite the fact I was fairly sure she was leading me to the slaughter. My queen, Not now, Melina interrupted, still speaking with a calm and collected demeanor as we walked away from the foreshore, both of us stopping at the second-last caravan to arrive, where she waved the men away and allocated us our own space within the back of that new campsite. Her left hand moved over to the cart's handlebars and had to give it a fair amount of force just to open the stuffy jewel-encrusted cart, yanking down its canvas roof as the loot inside it caved down upon its own heavy weight, dropping out treasure by the dozens, all priceless silver and gold artifacts falling before my feet while I dived down to catch the rest of them from falling. So, I'm afraid to say, you've got me at a standstill, Milena said. One might say a conflict of sorts, she added. On one side, you disobeyed me, again. Put my daughter into danger, again. You compromised our entire conquest because of your own selfish motivations to pretend you're something you're not, she ranted with a stern and assertive emphasis to her speech. Normally, by then, I would have bowed my head in admission of my own guilt, but I surprised myself by keeping my head up, still confused by her calm and, so far, non-aggressive tone, although still scared for my life, despite the generous rewards of priceless gold and silver trinkets she dropped at my feet. On the other hand, however, if it were not for you and your reckless intervention, things may not have gone as well as they did, she surprisingly complimented me. Who knows how many might have died if you and Anera hadn't helped Arlo and Akoni find a way out of Midas's trap, she confessed before giving a short pause, allowing me to process her words. I'm not going to be able to stop the rumors of what you did. When you're home, you will be regarded as our city's newest hero. And for that alone, you will have to be rewarded in some way, she continued, kicking a couple more shiny ornaments towards me from under the wagon where they'd rolled. So this entire carriage is yours, she finally stated, with a certain level of dissatisfaction and defeat in her tone. You're joking, I said, staring blankly down at the wealth of an entire castle in the making. Thank you, my lady, I added, very confused over what was happening and bending down to inspect all the treasure at my feet. Not so quick, Kaya, she then stated ominously, making me look up. By rewarding your insolence, I'm going to encourage others to be just as rebellious as you, which means you cannot go completely unpunished either, she continued, her tone changing to the vindictive one I'd expected at the start of the conversation, my back straightening stiff as I looked back at her wide-eyed and fearful. 2 hands heavy and full of treasure, as I stood there, exposed and unable to protect myself from any sudden lashings she might wish to exercise. You become a real burden to the crown. You know that, right? And I don't care what deals I have made. When we are home, you will collect your things and leave for good. Wait, what deals? I exclaimed. You're banishing me from the capital? You can't do that. Dear, I can do a lot more than just that. So don't try and contest this, she threatened, taking a closer step towards me. This doesn't have to be a fight, Kaya. You are a servant without a family when you enter the capital. And you could be a noble lady upon your exit. Leave and you'll be free to do whatever you want. Just not around my family, she then said with a harsh snap to her voice. I knew she was giving me a lot more than she had to, but money meant nothing to me when it came to my safety. I was appalled at the thought of being kicked out of my house forcefully just like Midas had, even if it was her home she was kicking me out of. The old me would have accepted the treasure in a heartbeat, counting it as a win as I left her tyrannous capital for good. But the new me was more determined and resilient than ever, smart enough to know this was hush money made to cover up some atrocious indiscretion she believed I knew about Midas and the campaign. I'm not going to leave Milena, I stated abruptly and stubbornly, calling her by her name as a true test of my outstanding resolve. What did you just say? She demanded. Midas knew who my parents were, I said to her, gazing directly into her blue eyes as I dropped the treasure in my arms. And I'm willing to bet that means you probably do too, I said while taking a step over the colorful rubble to get closer to her in my own confrontation. You're just as insane as he is, she quipped back to me defensively. Why did you take me out of the orphanage all those years ago? I asked, determined to know the truth. What is it that you know about my parents? I pressed as I stopped being afraid of her and began to confirm my own suspicion based on the look of dread on her face. Milena put a hand out to my chest to stop me. Say another word or take another step forward, and it'll be your last, she quickly threatened. Only then did it burden me to know that I was indeed moving closer forward. You'll be buried here forever, she viciously added, the immortal warrior within her beginning to burn its way through as I pushed my luck way too far. "If you could harm me, you would have done it already," I snapped back in a hopeful but wild bluff, my heart pumping faster and faster, no longer in control of what I was saying but too far pledged to be able to back out of my choices. "Why do you hate me?" I finally asked, my aggression subsiding to curiosity, as for the first time ever, I dared ask that question out loud to her face. I could feel the treasures rolling and moving by my feet as I noticed the wind subtly wave and swoop around her body, as if her scaly-looking skin was retracting like plate mail armor that prepared her for combat. It made me feel threatened enough for my lurking shadow to come out from the shade against the half-open cart, it steadily rising from beside Melina and me. A look of concern filled Melina's eyes as she gazed upon it. A look one might call fear, if they didn't know any better. "Because you're poison," she responded back, unwilling to even attempt to hide it, although lowering her hands peacefully and dropping her guard as I too lowered mine. "Just like Midas, you taint everything you touch." "You think I don't see what you really want?" she continued. "Maybe your prize isn't something as simple as silver or gold, but so long as others might believe it is, I really couldn't care less. So first chance you get out of my castle, and leave any feeble affections you might have for my son or daughter behind as well," she said. "I've offered you wealth beyond your wildest dreams, for doing something that would have sent any other to the gallows, and you dare spit that back in my face?" she continued, retaking her former authoritarian stand. "You offered me nothing. You bribed me. You bribed me because you're hiding something, and even though I don't know what that exactly is yet, all the money in this world won't stop me from figuring it out," I bit back, proud of myself for standing up to her. The two of us stared at each other in silence before she finally said, "I have done more for you than you could ever understand." Then tell me," I shouted back at her, the first time I'd ever yelled directly in her face. She looked torn over whether to tell me what she knew or keep it a secret. A moment of thought passing, only to have her turn around and walk away from me, leaving me alone with my new carrot of wealth. I was in shock over the fact she just walked away in surrender, giving me the victory, much more shocked than the bounty of treasure I'd just received. My entire world had just been turned on its head, and yet my own head could think of nothing other than what it was that she knew about my parents. The irony was I shouldn't have been angry over her wanting me out of the capital. I hated living in the palace under her constant supervision anyway. I dreamed of a day I could finally be free, and that my best friend, the princess, would have no problem running away to visit me wherever I was. But I knew taking this deal meant never seeing the prince again. Maybe Melina was right, and that getting away from him was for the best. I loved the sight of him so much so that it had become too painful to be around him anymore, knowing that he was betrothed to another. Melina was right to say this was a huge win for me, a lifestyle upgrade unlike any other imaginable. I needed a moment to compose myself. I focused on the quiet serenity of the calm wind and crashing ocean waves, while I picked up the fallen treasure and threw it back into my carriage cart, looking inside at the riches one last time before covering it back up with the canvas roofing, taking one small silver tray for Puppy to crunch on as I made my way back to the gateway stone, the first time smiling as I began to comprehend all of the potential lives I could live, given my sudden change of circumstance. I didn't say anything to the others once I reconvened with them and the rest of the beta group. We were all sitting down beside the coney and his pottery lesson class, giving the small silver tray to his leashed-up raptor secretly, as I quietly entered in upon his instructions of how to make the desalinating jugs. "You all right there?" Anera whispered to me, trying to mold a thin bending nozzle onto the top end of a jug barrel as directed. "So how much trouble did I get you in?" she asked with remorseful sorrow. "None," I lied. "I'm all fine," I said with a smile, wanting to make her feel better. "See, it always works out for us in the end," she smiled back, for once blissfully unaware of what I and her mother had discussed. Childishly, I took some of Arlo's clay for myself as I sat beside Ode, who seemed most content and happy with the arts and crafts time we were all attending. From there on, my day was only fun and breezy. After finishing Akoni's pottery lesson, everyone left the jugs on the campfire to distill, allowing those tiny little fire braziers to heat like a kettle. Meanwhile, Anera, Arlo, and I took to the ocean's cooling waves to refresh ourselves, mostly just body surfing the waves before eventually relaxing in the sun on the beach. After having shown some compassion, Milena ended up sending Zephyr with a few others to pick up food and supplies from his home village, giving him at least a small reprieve to once again be with his townsfolk, leaving the rest of the day for us to be mostly recreational. By late afternoon, Arlo, Anera, Akoni, and I volunteered to help with the firewood effort by picking up logs and chopping down a few trees in the fields beside the first inlet quarry that went along the outskirts of the field. The prince began showing me how to swing an axe, only for the task of chopping wood to turn into a competition of who could make the biggest bundle of wood. By the end, we had far more wood than we ever could have needed. Out in the flats of the neighboring woodlands and its little lagoon lake quarry, some men had moved rocks from the cliffs and made little rock pool spots. The scorching sun, turning the water warm as many others, like us, followed in suit and turned that poolside forest clearing into our own hotel day springs. Both Akoni and Puppy were scared of the water for similar reasons, but even they could find pleasure devising his own wooden deck chair to sit on, sipping on desalinated water through a tumbleweed straw, relaxing while Zephyr's men returned to a standing ovation as soldiers came up to kiss the caravans, kegs and containers of food and drink slowly being pulled towards us in vastly stockpiled carts. It was crazy to see just how happy, energetic, and playful everyone became with each other the second that food reached the foreshore, the atmosphere changing almost completely. Joy and relief filling the soldiers as everyone, other than the four of us, joined into groups with their friends, relaxing while they shared stories and entertained one another amidst the slowly descending twilight. The sunspire's shine was quiet week out here, but once we went back onto the beach, we had very little to be afraid of, as once again, for one last night we were far out enough to be able to see a few of the brightest stars, humbled by Aurora and Orion, and Cupid and Psyche, while the bonfires of the beach perimeter were lit, the campfires helping to ward off the great onset of insects and other predators. Many members of the army came over to me and the others to ask for some of our logs so that they, too, could make simple makeshift tables and equipment to put around their own sandy dugout trench pits.